Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's Focus interview. Today we're talking about historical empathy with our Australian authors Melanie Innes, Daniella Forster, and Sarah Gurr, whose article is titled Historical Empathy, Ethically and Culturally Responsive Teaching. So first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. And here comes the first question. So in your article, you refer to a case in which a historical empathy task in the classroom went wrong. How can teachers assess whether a task worked well?
I think it's very difficult when we think about historical empathy, because I suppose to some extent it doesn't necessarily fit into those really standard kind of tick a box assessment practices that, have traditionally been what we might think of when we think about an, end of topic assessment or something like that. But my feeling is that with historical empathy, a lot of it is really in the preparation, making sure that you have set up the task really well, and thinking about those different components of historical empathy. So historical empathy is quite a meaty sort of topic in history education. And I'm sure, as you know, Carina, there are a number of different perspectives around this and whether or not this should or should not be an aim of history education. So I suppose it's important to preface that I'm coming from this as someone who, I would encourage historical empathy tasks in the classroom for the purpose of, thinking about making sure that students are able to gain an idea of the perspectives of the other, and really thinking about, their perspectives on historical events and how they might be different for people of different backgrounds. And to me, this is particularly important when we live in a multicultural society such as we do in Australia. And it is one of our aims of Australian education, that students will become active and informed members of the community. So to me, this idea is quite linked to that idea of citizenship in a multicultural or even globalized world, in that way.
I think when we're thinking about constructing a historical empathy task, we need to appreciate the role that emotions play in moral development, and in the kinds of goals that history education might have. And I think there's a lot to be gained when we're curating an emotionally rich experience for students to be able to understand the different orientations to history and the different perspectives that others have. And part of that is leveraging their moral emotions. And moral emotions are really important to understanding injustice. So, for example, we use emotions to help us make decisions, moral decisions. And so thinking about the assessment task and what makes it valuable is thinking about the kinds of decisions that the students will be needing to make and the kinds of perspectives that they'll need to be taking. What emotions will this draw on for them? So, for example, we try to discern morally salient features in a historical event. For instance, disappointment or fear or anger being associated with injustice. And that can help us alert to something that's going wrong or something that's going right. And then that helps us leverage our emotions to make moral decisions.
I think picking up off the points mentioned so far about citizenship and history education and moral education, the common ground, I think, in part of what we're trying to achieve in each of these is helping students to develop a deeper understanding about the worlds in which they exist in and the who they are as a person, how they relate to the worlds around them. And so I think when this sort of opportunity for historical empathy goes well, you develop that deeper understanding, which I think is really valuable and something that some of the commentaries spoke about, but also an opportunity for, I suppose, justice in some ways, and sort of learning about different perspectives and developing a deeper understanding to which you would probably not be able to be afforded otherwise if you didn't have that opportunity for rich historical empathy tasks.
Even if they create a sense of discomfort, even if they generate a sense of uncertainty or feelings that of anger and disappointment or injustice, these sorts of discomforts shouldn't be linked to a criteria of whether this task should continue. We need to think carefully about the kinds of discomfort that are justifiable, and as even if students are experiencing emotions around historical empathy tasks, it's not necessarily indicated that it's going wrong.
I was going to ask about that because your article suggests that there is this kind of do no harm principle. And could you just talk more about how you can really design a task in which students are emotionally affected, so they are responsive to the kind of ethical problem that you present to them, but at the same time, no harm is done?
Begins with, you know, a lot of the things that we think about with historical empathy as well is this idea of care. You know, often we're asking students to empathize with, you know, a historical agent or peoples because we want them to develop a kind of sense of care. But when we talk about care, there's an idea that if students are more likely to care more about the people that they're studying and become impassioned about a particular issue or injustice, they're far more likely to use that learning experience to take further some further action, or perhaps, you know, a slightly deeper commitment to a particular aspect of social justice, or you know, some element of that within their lives, which again goes back to this idea of citizenship in a multicultural nation like Australia.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that history addresses some of the most difficult knowledge that humans have. You know, there are things that we never wish to repeat. There's things that we cannot understand why they occurred the way that they did because they caused so much harm. And so when we introduce students to these stories, these narratives, these different perspectives, this different rationale, they can experience not only a sort of a shaking of their own world, perhaps, but also a sense that their worlds are changing and it's feeling very uncomfortable. But I think there is some discomfort that is justified around these questions especially. And when we think about discomfort, we need to think about, and I draw on ideas about John Dewey here, about growth. How do we allow students to focus on their growth in lots of different ways? And that often means discomfort and stretching out and being challenged, but also having a sense perhaps of righteous anger, having a sense of disgust. And those things can be very instructive for their own moral development and perhaps help them in the shape of their empathy for others and the others' experiences. And there's no way that we can really understand the experiences of others in any way, but I think there's a certain level of discomfort and harm that is justifiable. But then there are other forms of harm, like poor pedagogical practice, poor curriculum design, poor assessment task design, that actually create more harm. So I think if that helps to sort of clarify, there is some differences, there's some good harms. You know, we can't always learn, it's not always easy to learn, and that difficulty can be a good thing. But as I said, history is focused so much on difficult knowledge. We need to be able to deal with different forms of these difficulties intelligently and together through dialogue, I think is really important.
Going back to the original question about how do we know, you know, how do we design a good empathy task or can be sure a good historical empathy task has worked well? A lot of it is even thinking about, is a historical empathy task the appropriate task for what I'm trying to achieve right now? You really need to reflect on your purpose and your aim and whether or not historical empathy is the right tool. It's a great tool, but if it's like with anything, if you're using the tool for the wrong job, it's not going to work as well. So I think that's a really important point for history teachers to be reflecting on as well.
What is a task in which historical empathy is an appropriate approach? So what would you try to achieve, and how do you know whether it's worked? Like when you talk to the students afterwards, how do we know whether they have empathized in the way that we wanted to, or how do we know that they were not completely overwhelmed? Because really, to put yourself in the shoes of a person you know, like a Holocaust victim or a slave in the 18th century, isn't that really overwhelming? And
Absolutely.
isn't there a way of you should not appropriate the experience of someone in
Yes.
these like very extreme circumstances, and to suggest to students that they could actually just, you know, for the time of one session, 50 minutes or 60 minutes, really empathize with what these people were going through? Isn't there a danger to that?
I think, yes, there is a danger to that. And this is, you know, why it does need to be planned out really well. And it's very important to draw a line between historical empathy tasks and reenactment tasks. And Kerry Gerard actually did this very well in one of our responses as well to our article, where she talked about the dangers of interpreting historical empathy as reenactment. That's not what we're trying to achieve with historical empathy. It's really about, you know, you must have a deep knowledge of the context. Like I said before, you're trying to avoid presentism as well. So there's a self-reflexivity that is required to be able to engage. You know, if we're trying, historical empathy is different from empathy in that, you know, it takes it kind of that step further, where we really are not only trying to imagine how another person would feel, but it's another person that's living in a completely different context from us. So you almost need to reflect on your own positionality, where you are in the world, you know, how all of these different experience and ideas may have influenced your perspective. And you almost need to try and set that aside a little bit, which of course is easier said than done. And it's an awfully big task to be setting for 15-year-olds as well. But again, I would caution against providing a really generalist answer here, because whether or not a task is appropriate, or if it's going to cause harm, or how I decide that, is really going to depend on the context that I'm teaching in. You know, here in our Australian context, you know, when I'm teaching, if we were teaching about, you know, the frontier wars, as Daniella mentioned before, and some of the massacres, which up until recently, you know, have sort of been a taboo subject in the Australian context, you know, that would be something that I would be, you know, really thinking about the context in which I was teaching that. You know, and the way that we explored that idea. And it would really depend on, you know, the students and their backgrounds within my room that would determine whether or not engaging with historical empathy in that task is appropriate at all. You know, and it would be that, you know, teachers using their professional judgment and their knowledge of their students to really think about whether or not this is appropriate, and how best to set it up with those students. So I would certainly have, you know, it would take quite a bit of scaffolding and setting up to make sure that students understand the purpose of the task, to help them to realize that we're not looking for you know, we're not looking for them to recount events and things like that. What we're really looking for is for them to be able to, you know, try and to use what everybody says about it, get into the shoes of someone else, but really thinking about, you know, drawing on historical sources to do that, using their knowledge of the historical context. You know, this is not the sort of task that you could place at the beginning of a unit, for example. The students would need to already have a very deep knowledge of the kind of substantive subject matter to be able to engage, to be able to connect with the historical context in which, you know, the event or people that you're asking them to empathize with has occurred.
And I think I agree, Mel, that it's really contextual. But Carina, I think you've raised a really important point, that there is danger here, and some fairly significant danger here, that we could even assume to understand the mind of another in any way. I mean, we very rarely even understand our own minds and why we do things. So I think there is a risk not only of perhaps overestimating the epistemological demands of the task, but also potentially re-traumatizing students who have a historical connection to those events, whether they're second or third generation Holocaust survivors, whether they're survivors of the stolen generation, whether they're survivors of the slave trade and victim survivors of other situations that we speak about in history. So there is a real danger, as Mel's emphasised, not to put this at the very beginning, certainly not even to consider at what point they have reached the capacity to address historical empathy later on, or as a formative task rather than an a summative task as well. They're thinking about how they reflect themselves throughout, as a diary, perhaps, that comes along in small chunks rather than as something that is summative of their entire knowledge of that historical topic. So I think, certainly not re-traumatizing, not overestimating the epistemological burden here, and thinking carefully about the nature of the assessment and its role.
Melanie mentioned before too the importance of preparation and planning. And I think part of that is pedagogical, part of it is aligning to curriculum, part of it is knowing who your students are. But I think also there are things that you can hopefully be able to access within your school that can offer support after the fact as well, because there may be family histories that Daniella is talking about here or that Melanie was talking about before, but there could also just be other things that are triggering or distressing for any number of students and in any number of ways. And I think I don't have the seniority to offer lots of pedagogical advice here, but I think accessing counselling support tools or mental health support facilities, there's plenty of things online, but also I'm sure many schools would have access to those. So just having conversations with colleagues and students and being really clear about support is something that I think could also really help those who need it, but also those who may see it from peers and things. And
it shouldn't
preparation
be
all around.
it shouldn't be a surprise to the community either, the school community. So I think there's a really strong point to be made about collaboration. And so that the parents don't suddenly come across this assignment in the student's bag and wonder what this is all about. It should be absolutely clear to the parents that there are tasks of difficult knowledge that their children are going to be undertaking, and that it's a collaborative effort, that it recognises the community assets as well, their knowledge that they can bring to this. We've got long oral traditions of history here as well that can be brought directly into the classroom if community are interested in doing that and supportive of that. So I think it is a process that shouldn't be undertaken alone by one teacher reflecting in their mind necessarily. It does need to be, I think, a bigger process and dialogue amongst all the different stakeholders in the students' education, because history belongs to everybody. It's not just the teachers or the curriculums, or it is ours, everybody, and we all have something to contribute and some orientation that we own ourselves as historical beings.
Thank you guys so much for joining me. I think this is very just valuable for all kinds of history education people who are thinking about these very challenging topics. And we come from different backgrounds. You come from Australia, I come from Austria. We have different legacies, historical legacies to present to students and make them respond to the kind of things that we've experienced as a society. And I just I'm very grateful that you took the time to talk to me about this. Thank you.
Thank you
so much for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we see it as an important point of reflection as well, which is what sparked this article in the first place. So thank you so much.